What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Void. My name is Brennan.
My name is Tyler.
And here on this podcast, you just get to listen to a bunch of youth pastors talk about anything, everything, mostly nothing. But today we are joined by a special guest. And before I introduce you to our special guest, we did at our youth ministry what we called a summer bash, and it was a giveaway where we gave away a bunch of things. People got raffle tickets. Well, one of the prizes was, if you won this prize or this level, you got to come onto The Void and basically steer the ship of the conversation today.
Highly esteemed prize right there.
So we're pumped to introduce you, all of the listeners and viewers, if you're watching on YouTube, to Skylar today. So Skylar, say hey to everybody.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, your favorite moments of The Void, any and everything.
Well, I'm an upcoming junior in high school. I'm part of our JROTC program, so I'm also on our rifle team, so I compete in shooting. And I think my favorite part of The Void is just Tyler's obscure ideas of the world.
Amen.
But how many push-ups can you do, though?
In what time frame?
It's a veteran question.
Yeah, like how many could you do without stopping?
Well, for our physical fitness test, it's usually like 1 to 2 minutes, and I've done up to 45 without stopping.
I can't do 45 in a week.
45?
Yeah.
I can't do 45 in a week.
I don't know if I could do it right now because I haven't been practicing, but I think my best is 45 in a row.
So everybody that's in JROTC, do they all, are they in it so that they can graduate and go right into the military?
No. So ROTC has nothing to do with joining the military.
Really?
Yes. It's a confidence boosting, and it's to get you in shape, and it's just kind of like a big family where you just go, you hang out, you work out, but really it's more of building confidence and leadership skills and traits to help you in the future with future jobs.
Nice.
Because they also teach like really important life goals, like saying sir and ma'am when you're talking to older people or people above you, or just being respectful, or how to, we do something called a promotion board. So you stand in front of a table of your higher ups and you kind of just do what they ask you to do. And it's kind of like an interview, just more military style.
You can definitely tell when you're talking to like an ROTC kid. Like I know there's like a lot of like stereotypes or whatever.
1,000%.
Like that y'all are weird. But yeah, they'll look you in the eye, y'all are like super competent. That part is like really refreshing.
Yeah.
We really we try to drive it home of like maintaining eye contact and trying to hold a conversation rather than just saying hey and walking away. And like when we have special guests come to our events, we'll like shake their hands, introduce ourselves. It's just, we really try to make sure that it's like really respectful.
Yeah, like just basic life principles. Yeah.
Well,
wish every teenager would do that.
Skylar crushes it, not only coming to youth, but ROTC and everything else she does. But we were really excited as we talked about this episode that we, obviously as youth pastors, we spend most of our time with teenagers and this generation. But we don't get many opportunities to actually talk to and ask conversations live on the pod to people in your generation. But we'll get there. But you actually had an interesting idea.
I did.
That you were like, I think we could talk about that. You want to tell us what that is?
I thought we could talk about expectations versus reality.
Expectations versus reality.
Well, it's good too because like we speak for teenagers all the time. We're like, oh, teenagers think this. And I told her that, so it'll be great to hear from like a teenager. And she was like, well, I don't want to speak for my whole generation. I was like, well, you're going to, so no pressure.
Yeah. So define a little bit what you mean by expectations versus reality.
More in every time you think expectation versus reality, you think of like those cringy pictures where it's like, oh, you think I'm going to get this haircut and it ends up being this. But really, it's more of like going into high school, 8th graders are like, oh my gosh, this is so cool because I'm getting all this freedom. I'm going to be able to drive soon, but it's also really scary. But then you actually get in there and you get in the rhythm of it. And it's like, it's kind of refreshing because you're not having all the all the restraints that you get in middle school, but as you start going through high school, it's like, wow, this is really happening. It's going by really fast. And then you start driving, you're like, oh my gosh, like now I have this responsibility. And then you get a job, and it's like college is coming up. So really people think it's like, oh my gosh, I'm growing up, I get all this freedom. But growing up is really like kind of scary almost, because you don't expect it to like hit you so fast.
Right. What do you think is an expectation that you feel like culture has of your generation? And what would you say the reality of that expectation is?
Okay, so I feel like a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, this generation had so much exposure to like the mental health like stuff. And everyone's like, I feel like older generations are kind of looking at Gen Z and just being like, this generation, they all have to have something. They all say they have something because they think it's the normal.
You mean like have like diagnosis?
Yes.
And stuff? Okay, yeah.
Like I feel like older generations are like, everyone says they have anxiety, everyone says they have depression or stuff like that. But in reality, it's not the whole generation, but just because we as a generation are more comfortable talking about it now versus like past generations, they weren't really like given the opportunity to talk about it. I feel like everyone thinks that all Gen Z thinks it's like cool and normal to have mental health issues.
You would say that you don't think that's true like at all?
No, I don't think so. I feel like a lot of people are more comfortable talking about it and more open about it, but it may seem like they're trying to like be like, oh, I have all these things.
Yeah, that's true.
Go for it.
No, I was just gonna say that's a good thought. That's what I was gonna ask you is like what gets said about like your generation that you hate the most? Would it be that?
It would be like just saying that we all are saying we have mental health issues. But in reality, it's like we're just more comfortable talking about it than past generations, because past generations, like, it wasn't much of a thing that was talked about, so it kind of got suppressed.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Would you agree, though, because depending on your response, I think it informs the second part of this. My first question to you is, do you think that your generation is more anxious than prior generations?
Yes.
Okay. So why do you think that is?
I feel like a lot of it just stems from everything that's going on in the world, not necessarily just stuff going on in our generation, but just like everything is kind of like chaotic right now, like with COVID and all the protests and just a lot of stuff you just see all the bad stuff on the news, and then all the stuff that gets blown out of proportion and they try to cover it up with interesting stories.
Yeah.
And then you have the pressure of like older generations or like adults or school that are being put on you. And then you also go onto social media and you just see everyone's perfect lives that they post about.
Expectation versus reality.
Yeah.
Which I was going to ask, just to like, not to like push you, but like, don't you think that like older generation, even millennials, which millennials are a little closer, but don't you think they experience some of the same stuff? And maybe it is just because like, because you're so right. That is like this stamp that older generation puts on Gen Z is like the like the super hyper aware, like depressed and anxious generation. But while I think that's totally unfair, don't you think that, say like boomers, for example, like or like whatever, even people before, like in going through like World War II, like the Vietnam War, don't you think they experienced kind of some of that same stuff? So what do you think makes it to where like a teenager now is 3 or 4 times more likely to have anxiety than a teenager 30 years ago?
I feel like it's not necessarily they're more likely to have it. I think it's they're more likely to talk about it.
Right.
Because older generations, I've talked to like some close adults in my life about this, and they've kind of been like, well, as a kid, it was kind of frowned upon almost to have these feelings, and so you kind of just had to repress them down and not talk about them and just get over yourself. But now in this generation, it's like you have all these helplines, you have people to talk about it, you have people like asking you to talk about it now. And I feel like it's not more likely to have depression or anxiety or anything like that. It's more this generation is more likely to talk about it than the past ones.
I think that's fair.
What do you think that looks like in 20 years?
Ooh. I feel like it's still going to be like a pretty significant thing that's going to be talked about, but I don't think it's going to have like, I feel like right now, especially since COVID's still happening, it's just not as big.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of it's kind of like being secluded and all this stuff going on, but I feel like everyone's kind of getting those worries, like a lot of people are getting depressed and anxious. And so it's kind of spiked right now, but I feel like in 20 years, it still be like something that's talked about mental health wise, but I don't think it's going to be as big of a thing as it is right now.
You think it's like a peak right now?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that.
I feel like it's kind of like a scale. It's going to go up and then down.
Yeah. I think too, like on that note, like we're always talking about in human history, it's just a cycle of hitting the bumpers. It's just a cycle of overcorrecting. To your point about how, and my dad actually has a lot of stuff to say about this. He says like when you were a kid, like you just like don't be sad or just like, whatever. Yeah. And so there definitely wasn't that space. But so now while we have like this, which if I'm being honest, I definitely, I 100% know anxiety, depression are real problems. I do think it's, I don't want to say exaggerated. I do think it's like overemphasized a little bit, but I think that is an overcorrection to the era you're talking about of like, you don't have time to be anxious or depressed. Like so this is right now, I think we're in this season or in this like period, 10, 15 year period of an overcorrection of like, let's extra focus on mental health because we've never done it before. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I think.
And going off of what you said, like, I feel like it is like a big problem and like a lot of people are diagnosed with it, but I also feel like people in this generation, if they don't have mental health issues, but then they see all this stuff about it, they kind of like, their brain tells them, oh, you might have this, and so they self-diagnose and then go around saying they have it instead of going to see someone.
That definitely happens.
So I feel like that causes the stigma of like this entire generation thinks they have something.
There's two things that just absolutely trigger me. One, well, they're similar. One is when someone says I have ADHD, and two is when someone says they have OCD. I'm not saying like those don't exist, but I'm like,
straightening a pencil isn't
your
OCD.
Foot doesn't mean you have ADHD. And like you straightening your phone on your desk, you don't have OCD. Like that's a real thing that always bothers me. It's like, oh, I have OCD. I can't sit still. I'm like, no, you don't. No, you don't.
That really is a big thing. The terms have been getting loosely used as time goes on, and I feel like it kind of needs to like reel back in a little bit, not because I'm saying like people don't have it, but like it is a self-crippling disorder, like OCD, like you can't do anything until you do your pattern. And then people saying, oh, I have OCD because I need
my right shoe on my right foot and my left. I mean, I'm so OCD.
Yeah.
I'm like,
I have to straighten my pencils on my desk before I can do anything. Like that's not OCD. That's a thing with you.
Well, even speaking about anxiety and depression, I think this is something I'm learning too, is that there are, clinically diagnosed anxiety disorders. There's clinical depression, but then there's also like this low-grade anxiousness.
Anxious and anxiety are different things.
Right, that kind of lives like, sometimes I think that's the body's way of saying like, either this is important and it matters, or and you're nervous, or like maybe it's your body's way of saying you need to pump the brakes a little bit. But that low grade, and same with like depression, not saying depression, but there are certain things, and we kind of talked about this on Wednesday night. There are certain things when it comes to depression as it's been defined, I think, generationally, where it's like expectations versus reality. Your life, especially when you're young, not saying we're still young, your life isn't going to turn out exactly how you planned. There's going to be hills, there's going to be valleys, and so there's going to be moments of sadness. There's going to be moments where you don't want to do what you have to do. There's going to be moments where you're just kind of down. But I think, to your point, Skylar, we have maybe exaggerated that a little bit and just thrown depression on everything.
I feel like people get confused between the difference between depression and being sad or being anxious and anxiety.
Yeah.
I feel like...
Well, I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Anxious anxiety. That doesn't make any sense to me because anxiety is just a noun behind like the adjective anxious. So how are they
So
different?
like anxiety disorders, like per se, it's like you can't do certain things because of how anxious you are. Like you physically cannot do it, or like you cannot handle certain situations because your mental state, you just can't do it. But like being anxious is like being worried about a test you have, like, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious about failing this test, but you don't have anxiety.
So it's like being depressed is different than like having depression. You're like that, like actual like label.
Depression, like it's more of you don't have motivation.
Right, but I'm saying like you're saying like I'm anxious about this versus I have anxiety is like a
Yes.
whole nother step. Oh yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's for me too. In talking about the expectations versus reality is like, I just wonder why that is because it is like this, just like with anything we talk about, two different sides. You've got not only the older generation, but even a lot of our generation that's like you're just sad, like you just are going through. Not everything's gonna be perfect, which all that's true. But then you have the other generation. It's like, no, you're not listening. Like you don't understand me, which is more like your generation. So. I guess like why I've always wondered why is there such a big gap, and with expectation versus reality too. Do you think that your generation is like expected to act and be a certain way? Do you feel like an expectation on you as you grow up to like fit a certain mold?
I do think there's like expectations placed on my generation, but I don't think we necessarily follow them as much. I feel like a lot of people are like, okay, well, this generation is like super strong because my generation's really like adamant about speaking about problems, about talking about mental health issues, just like all the things that weren't really talked about in the past. And so I feel like a lot of people expect us to be like the people who change everything, like the people who like lead the protests and the people who like make big changes in like big companies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But really, we're the same as everyone else. We just talk more about problems. There's nothing we can do that can really make huge changes like everyone wants us to.
That's fair.
Can we talk about the church for a minute?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because I think I see the more I spend time with your generation, the more I realize how not so different it is from millennials. Just like in a different vein, like millennials were really the first ones that, Xers really, came down on because kind of that tweener generation that knew what it was like to only handle paper, but also knew how to function in a digital space. And so millennials were like, this is better. Let's do this. And with your generation, as I'm sitting here hearing you talk, you're defining it as we're not that much different. We just see the unspoken things and want to talk about those things. So, but the statistics are everywhere that Generation Z is leaving the church in mass numbers. Attendance is declining. And even as, we're youth pastors and we have youth pastor friends that all kind of share a similar, thought that like, yeah, we're having a tougher time getting kids to camp, getting kids to Wednesday nights, which we understand sometimes that's the model. That's not necessarily generation. Sometimes the model's not good and needs to be reevaluated. But when it comes to things of the faith, what do you feel like, if you could define it, is the heartbeat of your generation when it comes to the things of God? Or do you feel like there's certain things that aren't talked about that should be talked about? Do you feel like the whole thing's a sham? Like, what do you, if you could like get on a podium and address,
which you're on one right now.
Yeah. And address older church leaders such as ourselves, and say, this is what we're looking for. Here's what we need help with that you're not helping us with.
Yeah.
Here's where you're missing the mark. What would you say?
I mean, I feel like, this is a loaded question.
I know. I asked you like 45 questions in one question.
And it's a great question.
I have an answer. I'm just trying to piece it together. So you guys have been doing an amazing job. I do feel like when you have the night where you did the whole thing about being stuck in a cave and like depression and the loneliness, those like weeks like really hit hard for a lot of the people in our church specifically that I know of. And I do feel like it is important to learn like the stuff you learn more in Sunday church, where it's like you learn about the Bible, you learn about the stories. But then I feel like on our youth nights, it is important to incorporate stuff that's going on right now in the message. And I feel like you guys are doing an amazing job at that.
Oh, thank you.
Great. That's
We'll,
what we were
we'll
looking
Venmo
for.
you after
Yeah, we're
this.
done now. So you can actually leave. No, I'm kidding. But no, I do think it's a good question because like it's all about statistics. And like you're saying, statistically, Gen Z, they're not interested. Your generation is leaving the church, and youth ministry, like if I can speak broadly and somewhat cynically, but this is absolutely true. There's no denying this. We were talking about it the other day. Youth ministry is declining all across the country. I mean, numbers. Every youth pastor I've yet to talk to. There's been one guy I've talked to in the past year that's like, yeah, we're growing, we're doing well. Every other youth pastor I've talked to is like, I can't get kids signed up for camp. I can't. Kids are leaving, not coming back, all this stuff, which even shift back 10 years, like when we were teenagers. I mean, church was like, I was like fighting to get there. It was super fun. Everybody wanted to go to church. And now it's just different. And I don't think it's because I do think a lot of the older generations and even our generation would tend to demonize Gen Z, your generation, and tend to say, well, they don't get it. They're stupid. They're this, they're that. Well, our DNA hasn't changed. So I just wonder what's happened to where, and, feel free to speak candidly on this, is like, why isn't Gen Z as interested with the church as like the previous generations? Because you said as a Christian, especially as a church leader, and you're like, if the next generation is even 10% less interested than the current generation, that's a problem, because you start to do those numbers and talk about 20 years from now, and it could be pretty scary. So why do you think Gen Z is, I wouldn't say running from the church, but definitely falling away?
I do think, at least with my generation, I obviously can't speak for the whole generation, but just from like what I know, I do think a lot of our generation is kind of like, well, yeah, we hear about all the old stories of the Bible. We hear about all the great things these people did or all the bad things that they learned from, but that's not what we want to hear. It's more, we want to hear about like actual things going on in the world. We want to hear about what to do in these kind of situations that we have right now that we just don't know how to handle. So like, for example, like if you're having mental health issues and you can't talk to your parents about it, or you can't talk to your friends about it, you're just kind of stuck in this bubble. And then you get to church and they're like, here's this guy that did all this stuff and he learned from all his mistakes. And that's what we want you guys to do. Yeah. It's kind of almost like pressure, because it's like, I have all this stuff going on, and then the church is telling me more stuff to do or more stuff to follow and do in my life. And it's just like a lot of my generation's like, I can't do it.
So it sounds like the breakdown is between what we read about and teach about in the Bible, what God does, and what does that mean for my situation at home right now.
I think a lot of churches don't make that connection. You guys are doing a great job of it, like I said, but a lot of churches don't make that connection. They're just kind of like, here's these stories, here's what's going on in the world, relate them. Yeah. They don't relate it for you. They don't make it make sense for most of the people that don't understand what they're hearing or reading.
So you would say, which we talked about this on a couple episodes back, and I was curious about, but it sounds like you're saying that your generation actually pays a lot of attention to current events. Would you say that's more like localized and American current events, or just like world events in general?
I think it is kind of localized, just because of, like, yeah, you have a lot of resources to like see all these things, but like you just see what's going on around the internet. You see like what's being posted about you, especially like TikTok and like Instagram. And then if something goes on, like we had some stuff happen at our school a few weeks back, and like it got spread around Snapchat like that. And I feel like it's just like you look on the internet and you see what everyone else wants you to see, but then my generation kind of digs a little deeper and like tries to find facts about it. Yeah. And I think like going back on a couple episodes when you talked about how much you hated the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard situation.
Stand by that.
My generation is like, oh my gosh, even though I might not be much of a big fan, I want to know what's going on. I want to know what's behind all of this. And like, if you looked at some of
You built your own defense.
yes, if you looked at some of the videos, like people my age are like analyzing her, and they're like looking at her facial features. They're she's closing her eyes too slow.
And I'm like, and they're like, oh, dude, Ben did such a good job. I'm like, who's Ben? Like, do you know this guy? I mean,
but like, I feel like it's more of we like to dig deeper in the topics that like kind of are like scratched on the surface level.
Mm-hmm.
So like especially like with just like big events going on, not necessarily like, oh, COVID or oh, this is happening, or like with the Russia and Ukraine stuff, it was like very surface level information. But then there's people in my generation that are like, I want to know more about it, so I'm going to look more into it. Whereas some people just kind of like, I'm going to watch the news and just listen to what the news says.
Yeah, and that going back to what I said in the conspiracies episode, which I said that's my favorite thing about your generation is that y'all are so like conspiratorial minded. Not thinking y'all think the earth is flat, but like y'all are the first generation. Millennials are the worst about it. But y'all are the first generation to like, you know, hear that and think like, oh, that doesn't sound right, and do a little extra digging. Like, would you agree with that? That's why all these like conspiracy theories, some are silly, some are absolutely true, but that's why those are kind of reemerging, is because you've got like, for whatever reason, your generation, kind of like the expectation versus reality. Y'all aren't really willing to, this is by far my favorite thing about your generation. Y'all aren't willing to accept you're supposed to do this and you're supposed to go here. You are like, no, but like, why? I'm not going to do that. I want to go over here, which I love. But why do you think that is? Why do you think rewind 15, 20 years and the last couple generations are like, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. And y'all are like, no, I refuse to accept that.
I feel like, oh, that's hard. I feel like it's more of we don't want to be told this is what's expected of you, this is what you want to do, this is what you need to do. I feel like we're more of, well, we want to look into all the different options and make that decision for ourselves rather than being told what to do about it. Because like past generations, I'm not saying like years and years back, or like I say past generations obviously because I'm one of the youngest ones right now, but it's like as growing up they were told like college, job, money, life, marriage.
Yeah.
It was like kind of just standardized, and now people in my generation have all these opportunities, but then you have people coming up to you and saying, well, you need to get good grades and a good ACT score so you can get into a good college, so you can get a good job, and you can start a good life for yourself, where it's like, I want to look into those decisions. I want to make those decisions for myself.
Right. And if I could like address this, I mean, this may be like a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think that what you're saying is a big piece to the answer of the question of like why Gen Z is falling away from the church. Because if I could speak candidly, I love all that. I mean, I said it like weeks ago. I love that, but it can also be like a double-edged sword when you read when it comes to absolute truth. And now when we talk about postmodernism, which if you don't know, postmodernism is basically a really poor but brief summary is like reality is what I want it to be. Like I have my truth and you have yours. And when it comes to the Bible, that doesn't work. There is such an element to like we had a Wednesday night where we looked at like how the Bible is like how it's all been inspired and how it's a rock solid like word of truth or whatever. And we have less and less people, especially in your generation, believing that or being willing to say, oh yeah, I'll take this and this and this out of the Bible, but I don't know about this. So I think that you all as a generation are missing that like submission piece of saying there is an absolute truth and I'm going to be wrong. And sometimes, like the Bible says, the heart is deceitful above all things. Sometimes I'm going to have a way I want to do it, but I need to lay that aside and follow God and follow Jesus and do what the Bible says. Do you think that your generation struggles with that a little bit because of the way y'all think?
I do. I think that's like a good like chunk of why a lot of my generation has stopped like coming to church or like stopped being interested. It's more of they're like, well, if I go to church, they're just gonna boss me around and tell me how to live my life and tell me what to do. Yeah. But it's like they don't even want to try. Whereas with other things, they'll be like, well, I don't want to be bossed around, but I'll listen to what you have to say and I'll give my opinion on it. Whereas a lot of the stigma in my generation when it comes to church is if I get there, they're going to tell me how to live my life and that what I'm doing is wrong. And I feel like that's a lot of the thought process that goes through my generation.
Yeah.
That really, like, I think that's one of the bad things that are going around.
I agree. I think that, like, you know, going back to like Isaiah, you know, your ways are better than my ways. Your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. I think if you were to do a poll, I think the majority of Gen Z would disagree with that. I think there is like a disconnect of like, no, but like what I want, my truth. And so as we do see cultural and we do see teenagers, and obviously like we talk about, it's going to bounce back.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like not the end of the world. Gen Z is you guys are like immaculately creative, immaculate free thinkers, have so many good things going for you. So, yeah, I just think that it's that pursuit of personal truth, I think is a really big detriment, because we sit and we're like, wow, there is a standard that's been set forth that a whole generation wants to revolt against, and that's good in some ways, but also bad in some ways. So that's all I have to say about that.
I do think it's like also a lot of my generation doesn't really think, well, they think more of the church thinks that their ideas are better than mine or their thoughts are better than mine versus the Bible, the word, like God, his ideas and his thoughts are better than mine. I feel like it's more if they blame the people than the actual idea of it.
Yeah,
That's good.
That's what we were talking about last week.
Because
really
like
good.
a lot of church, I'm not saying our church obviously,
Yeah.
but like a lot of churches around the world, they kind of just like pound the idea of this is what you do in life, this is what you need to do, rather than like giving that freedom to grow in it. They're kind of just like, here's the word, do it.
Yeah.
And I feel like my generation is like, that's what's pushing them back, is a lot of them are like, well, I don't want to be told how to do it. I want to learn it myself.
But even that, though, don't you think that's a little bit, I don't want to say like stupid, but like, don't you think that's a little bit stubborn to say like,
Yeah.
you're telling me what I should do, but like, I'm not going to do that. I want to learn for myself. Because now churches, you know, there is such a thing as Christian liberty. Is a huge concept. We do have freedom. And if you go to a church and all they're telling you is rules, do this, don't do this, then, you know, they don't really understand the gospel in the first place. So because it's about following Jesus in a relationship over rules. But I think that while you're right about that, I think that a lot of it is your generation is not okay with any rules or being told this is good for you. And that's really that's the biggest challenge for all of us in our faith, in our walk with God. That is always a tipping point. We walk, and we finally get to that point to where we're close with God. We know what the Bible says, but we also have our own ambitions, where you've got to choose. Am I going to pursue my own ambitions, or am I going to elevate the timeless, tried and true, inspired Word of God above what I want to do? And it's so hard. So I'm not saying it's easy, but
Well, and I think that what you're saying, Skylar, and what you're both saying, is hardwired into humanity. Because, I mean,
which part?
The part about I know God's way, and I have my way.
Oh yeah.
Because, I mean, you could go as far back in the Bible as you want and see this kind of dynamic that God sets up of like, hey, here is the road, and I promise you, if you take this road and stay on this road, your life will be actually rather quite simple.
Yeah.
But from the garden through the nation of Israel, all the way through the New Testament, even to today, it's like a continuous cycle of people being like, I see the road, I know the road, and I may get on and off from time to time, but I can't help but experience and make some decisions that are contrary to that, and which I really think God uses to refine us. Because I think there are, before you even said that, it's kind of what I was thinking is, I think there's some elements of life that, regardless of how many people are telling you, hey, this probably isn't a smart move, you may know it, but you will never know it.
Right.
Until you do it, you live it, realize, whoa, they were right.
It's like the hand on the stove thing. You can tell a kid the stove's hot 100 times, but until they touch it,
Yeah, and I think as we're having this conversation, I think it's really insightful for me to think about, okay, because we sit and think all the time, how do we help teenagers? How do we help teenagers? How do we help teenagers? And it's actually refreshing for me to think about, one, like you're saying, it's not that they're not interested in things of the faith. They're just interested in getting a little bit more of an understanding of how this applies to my life. That challenges me as a Bible teacher. But also knowing there are certain things that it doesn't matter how many times I tell you this is not a good decision, or how many people I get behind me saying that's not a good decision, you're going to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And is that what looks best from our point of view? Probably not. But it will be the thing that God uses 10 years in your life that's going to allow you to become a better follower, leader. So, I don't know. I'm refreshed after.
Yeah, no, me too. I am too.
this.
I really think there's no way to like really fix that. Like,
Yeah.
there's no way to like convince people that this is the way that this should be done, even though you have your own ideas that this is what you should do. I really think there's no way that to convince at least my generation that this is something that like you need to choose. I think it's more of figuring it out. And I really think no matter how hard we try, there's no way that we can fix that. But the people who are in my generation that are heavily involved with the church, we're going to go out and spread it like crazy. We're going to try to be bringing people in. We're going to be talking about it just because that's how we are.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, I do too. I think this is the last thing I'll say. The hardest thing is convincing, especially young people. That's why the Bible calls us sheep, is convincing young people. You can make a calculated decision, and you can decide what, and more often than not, as humans, our human nature, you're just going to be wrong. That is like nails on a chalkboard to a young person, to tell them you're probably wrong. They're like, no, I'm not. Like, stop saying that. So really understanding our own nature, understanding, I guess, just like how sinful we are and how much we need God, I think is definitely a big divide. So as long as you're out there spreading it, I'm cool.
Yeah, come on,
If
man.
I can sleep well at night knowing that Skylar's out there just spreading the word.
Yep. Did you bring 2 friends to Summer Bash?
Yes, I
Yep.
did.
So she's a bringer.
And my hair is not going to be. I'm not going to get that mohawk unless y'all bring some more friends. So, or not mohawk. Was it the Dr. Phil? What is that called? The fire truck or something like that.
Friar Tuck.
Is that what it was? Fire truck, close enough.
I can't even remember.
Yeah, whatever. But if you listen to this podcast, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, ILPC Youth. Share it to somebody who you really think would be interested in the conversation with the next generation. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to rate us if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Make sure it's 5 stars, and we'll see you on the next episode.